Please, don't do this to me. Don't forget all these years we've had. I'm begging you, don't leave us. Please remember our love.
She was 8 months pregnant when he opened the front door and told her to leave. No suitcase. No coat. No goodbye. Just a porch, a December wind, and the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place behind her. Her name was Margaret Ellsworth, and 12 hours earlier, she had been decorating a Christmas tree in the living room of a house she believed was hers. She had spent 19 years loving the man who locked that door. She had typed his college papers at midnight. She had sold her grandmother's pearls to help pay for his first business loan. She had buried 3 babies before this one finally took root in her womb. And on the night of December 24th, while a stranger sat on her couch wearing her bathrobe, the man Margaret had loved since she was 22 years old looked her in the eyes and said the 7 words that would change 3 lives forever. There's no room for you here anymore. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to understand how a 41-year-old pregnant woman ended up standing barefoot in the snow on Christmas Eve, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who Margaret Ellsworth was before she became the woman 3 counties in Tennessee would one day whisper about with something between awe and fear. Margaret was born in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight. Her father, Henry, ran the only auto repair shop within 40 miles. Her mother, Ruth, taught Sunday school at the First Baptist Church on Elm Street for 37 years. Margaret was the youngest of 3 girls, the quiet one, the one who read too much and prayed too hard and believed too easily. She graduated high school as valedictorian in 1995, went on to nursing school at the University of Tennessee, and met a young man named Daniel Ellsworth at a church singles retreat the summer she turned 22. Daniel was different from the boys back home. He was tall, polished, and ambitious in a way that made Margaret's small-town heart flutter. He was studying to become a dentist. He came from money, or at least the appearance of it, and when he kissed Margaret for the first time on a wooden dock overlooking Norris Lake, she believed, with every fiber of her being, that she had just met the man God had been preparing for her. They were married 18 months later in the same Baptist church where Margaret had grown up. She wore her mother's wedding dress. He wore a borrowed tuxedo. There were 93 guests, fried chicken at the reception, and a homemade peach cobbler that her Aunt Loretta had baked at 4 in the morning. Margaret was 24 years old, and she would later say that day was the happiest she had ever been. The first 10 years of their marriage looked from the outside like a fairy tale. Margaret worked as a school nurse at Westview Elementary in Knox County, where the kindergartners called her Miss Maggie, and the principal called her the heart of this school. She made $42,000 a year, every penny of which she funneled into Daniel's dental school tuition. She worked double shifts. She skipped lunches. She drove a 1998 Toyota Corolla with a cracked windshield, because Daniel needed a newer car to make a good impression on his professors. She balanced his checkbook. She ironed his shirts. She typed his case studies. And when Daniel finally graduated, when he passed his board exams, when he opened the doors of Ellsworth Family Dentistry on Main Street in their adopted hometown of Maryville, Tennessee, it was Margaret who hung the framed diploma on the wall with her own 2 hands. She was so proud she cried for an hour in the parking lot. But there was one thing the fairy tale was missing: a child. Margaret had always wanted to be a mother. It was, she once told her sister, the reason God had put her on this earth. So when the months turned into years and her belly remained flat, she began to worry. The first miscarriage came in 2008. She was 13 weeks along. The doctor said these things happen and not to lose hope. The second miscarriage came in 2011. She was 9 weeks along. Daniel held her in the hospital bed and promised her they would try again. The third miscarriage came in 2014. She was 16 weeks along, far enough that she had already painted the nursery a soft buttercream yellow. That one nearly broke her. She stopped going to church for 6 months. She lost 22 pounds. She slept on the floor of the empty nursery for 3 nights in a row before Daniel finally carried her back to bed. And Daniel, to his credit at the time, was patient. He was kind. He held her hand at every appointment. He prayed with her, even though Margaret suspected he had stopped believing in anything other than himself by then. What Margaret didn't know, what she could not have possibly known, was that somewhere during those years of grief, a small cold thing had begun to grow inside her husband. It was not a tumor. It was not a sickness. It was something quieter and far more patient. It was the slow, creeping conviction that Margaret had become an obstacle, that she had aged, that her body had failed him, that the woman he had married at 22 had been replaced, somewhere along the way, by a tired, sad woman who reminded him of everything he had not yet become. Daniel was 38 now, and he was beginning to look around his own life and find it lacking. His dental practice was profitable, but it was not impressive. His house was nice, but it was not enviable. His wife was loyal, but she was not, in his quiet and unspoken opinion, exciting. And it was in this exact frame of mind, in the spring of 2017, that Daniel Ellsworth first met a pharmaceutical sales representative named Vanessa Crow. Vanessa was 28 years old. She drove a white Audi. She wore tailored navy suits that cost more than Margaret's entire monthly clothing budget for a year. She had been calling on Daniel's dental practice for about 4 months before he ever really looked at her. But on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, Vanessa walked into Ellsworth Family Dentistry with a sample case of a new local anesthetic, and she made sure to sit on the edge of Daniel's desk while she explained the dosing protocols. She laughed at his jokes. She touched his arm twice. She told him with practiced ease that she had heard he was the best dentist in 3 counties, and she had been so looking forward to meeting him in person. Daniel, who had not been looked at like that by a woman in nearly a decade, felt something light up inside his chest that he had thought was permanently extinguished. By June they were having lunch every other week. By August they were meeting at a hotel in Nashville on Thursday afternoons. By October, Daniel had told Vanessa, over a bottle of expensive wine, that he was thinking about leaving his wife. And Vanessa, sipping that wine slowly, looked him in the eyes and said, "Then leave her, Daniel. You've been carrying her for 20 years. Maybe it's time she carried herself." What Daniel did not know, what he would not learn for another 14 months, was that Vanessa Crow was not who she said she was. The woman across the table from him had been fired from 2 previous pharmaceutical sales jobs for falsifying expense reports. She had a sealed juvenile record in the state of Georgia for credit card fraud. She had been involved 8 years earlier with a married attorney in Memphis whose wife had suffered a stillbirth at 26 weeks during the height of their affair. That woman, the attorney's wife, had taken her own life 6 months later. Vanessa had walked away from that situation with $22,000 in jewelry and a new car. And she had spent the years since refining her method. She did not pursue single men. She pursued comfortable, married, successful men whose wives had become, in their husbands' eyes, invisible. She was not looking for love. She was looking for a life. Someone else's life. And in Daniel Ellsworth, with his profitable practice and his loyal wife and his 5-bedroom house on a cul-de-sac, Vanessa believed she had found the most promising target of her career. Meanwhile, in November of 2017, after nearly 19 years of marriage, 3 miscarriages, 2 failed rounds of in vitro fertilization, and what Margaret would later describe as more prayers than there are stars in the sky, Margaret Ellsworth missed her period. She didn't tell Daniel. She had been here before, and she had learned not to hope out loud. She waited 2 weeks. She waited 3. She took a home pregnancy test in the staff bathroom at Westview Elementary on a Thursday morning, and when she saw the 2 pink lines, she sat down on the tile floor and cried so hard that the music teacher, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on the door 3 times before Margaret could answer. She went to her doctor that afternoon. Dr. Patricia Hammond, who had delivered babies in Blount County for 35 years, looked at Margaret's blood work, smiled gently and said, "Margaret, sweetheart, you are 8 weeks along, and everything looks perfect." Margaret called Daniel from the parking lot. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. When he answered, she could hear voices in the background, the sounds of his dental practice winding down for the day. She said, "Daniel, honey, I'm pregnant." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A pause that, in hindsight, Margaret would replay in her mind 1,000 times. A pause that lasted exactly 4 seconds, but that felt in the moment like it lasted a lifetime. And then Daniel said, "Wow, that's great, honey. Listen, I have a patient. I'll call you back." He didn't call her back for 6 hours. When he finally came home that night, he hugged her. He told her he was happy. He told her this was a miracle. And then he went into his home office, closed the door and called Vanessa Crowe. What he said on that call, Margaret would not learn until much later. But Vanessa, who saved every voicemail, every text, every recording she could get her hands on as insurance against the men she destroyed, would one day make sure the right people heard it. The next 8 months were, in many ways, the happiest of Margaret's life. She decorated a nursery in the same buttercream yellow she had used in 2014, but this time she did not paint over the wall when grief came. Grief did not come. The baby grew. The ultrasounds were strong. The doctor was pleased. Margaret bought tiny pink onesies because she had felt, somewhere in her bones, that this baby was a girl. She picked out a name, Grace, because she said she had been given grace upon grace upon grace. And this child was the proof. She glowed. Her co-workers at Westview Elementary threw her a baby shower in October. 47 women came. They brought casseroles and crocheted blankets and tiny knit booties. Margaret cried through every gift. And Daniel, when he came home from work each night, would put his hand on her belly, smile in a way that did not quite reach his eyes and say, "How's our little girl today?" Margaret did not notice that the smile was hollow. She did not notice that Daniel was working later and later. She did not notice that he had stopped sleeping in their bed 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. She did not notice because she did not want to notice. She was 41 years old, she was finally going to be a mother, and she was choosing with every cell in her body to believe in the man she had married. The first time Margaret heard the name Vanessa was on December 10th, exactly 2 weeks before her world ended. Margaret had stopped by Daniel's dental practice with a thermos of homemade chicken soup, because Daniel had mentioned that morning that he was coming down with a cold. The receptionist, a young woman named Hannah who had worked at the practice for 2 years, looked up from her computer when Margaret walked in, and her face went completely white. Margaret would never forget that look. It was the look of someone who knows a terrible secret and has just realized that the person it concerns is standing 3 feet in front of her. Hannah stammered. She said Daniel was with a patient. She said he might be a while. She said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, do you want me to call him for you?" And it was at exactly that moment that the door to Daniel's private office opened, and Vanessa Crowe walked out. She was wearing a navy blue dress. She was carrying a sample case. And she was laughing at something Daniel had just said. When Vanessa saw Margaret standing by the reception desk, her laughter stopped. Her eyes went cold. And then, in the space of a single breath, her face rearranged itself into a polite, professional smile, and she walked past Margaret with a small nod, as if Margaret were a piece of furniture she was being careful not to bump into. Margaret stood there for a long moment. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at the floor. And then Daniel laughed a little too loudly and said, "Hey honey, is that soup for me?" That night, Margaret did not ask Daniel who Vanessa was. She did not ask why Hannah had looked at her like that. She did not ask why her husband, who had not laughed at her own jokes in 2 years, had been laughing in a closed office with another woman. She did not ask because she was 8.5 months pregnant and she was afraid. She was afraid of what the answer might be, and she was afraid that asking the question would make it real. Instead, she went home, she ate dinner alone while Daniel caught up on emails in the office, and she lay in bed that night with her hand on her belly and she whispered to her unborn daughter, "It's okay, baby girl. It's just my imagination. Mama's just tired." But it was not Margaret's imagination. On the morning of December 11th, Dr. Patricia Hammond, who had been Margaret's OBGYN for the entire pregnancy, performed Margaret's 36-week checkup. The baby was measuring perfectly. The heartbeat was strong. Margaret's blood pressure was fine. And as Margaret was getting dressed to leave, Dr. Hammond closed the door to the exam room, sat down on her rolling stool, and said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "Margaret, I've been delivering babies in this county for 35 years. And in that time I have learned to read women the way other people read books. I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time answering it. Are you safe at home?" Margaret froze. Her mouth went dry. She did not know how to answer the question because she did not know in that moment what the answer was. Dr. Hammond watched her face for a long time. And then she opened a drawer in her desk, took out a small white business card, and pressed it gently into Margaret's hand. "Margaret," she said, "whatever is happening or whatever might happen, I want you to keep this card with you. Day or night. You call this number and I will answer. Do you understand me? Margaret nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. She put the card in her wallet, behind a photograph of her late father. She did not tell Daniel about the conversation. She did not tell anyone. And 13 days later on Christmas Eve, that small white card would be the only thing standing between Margaret Ellsworth and the worst night of her entire life. The morning of December 24, 2018, began like any other Christmas Eve. Margaret got up at 6. She made cinnamon rolls from scratch, the way her mother had taught her. She wrapped the last of the presents. She called her sister Patricia, who lived in North Carolina, and they talked for 45 minutes about the baby, about Christmas dinner plans, about everything and nothing. Daniel came downstairs around 8, kissed Margaret on the forehead, ate 2 cinnamon rolls without really tasting them, and announced that he had to run some last-minute errands. Margaret thought nothing of it. She spent the morning decorating the dining room table. She put out her mother's good china. She lit candles. She hummed Christmas carols. Daniel did not come home for lunch. He did not come home at 3. He did not come home at 5. By the time the sun set at 5:20 in the afternoon, Margaret was beginning to worry. She tried to call him. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. She sat down on the couch in the living room, looked at the Christmas tree, looked at the table set for 2, looked at the snow beginning to fall outside the window, and she felt, for the first time in many months, completely and utterly alone. Daniel finally came home at 6:47 in the evening. Margaret heard his truck pull into the driveway. She heard the front door open, and then she heard a second car door slam, and a second pair of footsteps on the porch. She stood up from the couch. She walked toward the foyer. And there, standing in her own front entryway, was Daniel Ellsworth, her husband of 19 years, and Vanessa Crow, the woman from the dental practice, who was carrying an overnight bag. Margaret looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the floor. Vanessa looked at Margaret with an expression that was somewhere between pity and contempt, and then she walked past Margaret into the kitchen, and began to pour herself a glass of wine. From Margaret's anniversary bottle. The one she and Daniel had been saving for their 20th anniversary in 6 months. Margaret heard the cork pop. She heard the wine being poured. She heard Vanessa take a long, slow sip. And then she heard Daniel clear his throat and say, "Margaret, sit down. We need to talk." Margaret did not sit down. She stood in her own foyer, 8.5 months pregnant, wearing a green Christmas sweater her mother had knitted for her 2 years before she died, and she said, "Daniel, what is happening?" Daniel could not look at her. He looked at the Christmas tree. He looked at his own hands. He looked at anything except his pregnant wife. And then he said in a flat, rehearsed voice, the words that would haunt every person in that room for the rest of their lives. He said, "Margaret, I want a divorce. I've been seeing Vanessa for over a year. She's moving in tonight. I need you to leave." Margaret laughed. It was not a real laugh. It was the sound a person makes when their mind cannot yet process what their ears have just heard. She said, "Daniel, I'm due in 8 days." Daniel said, "I know. That's why I waited until now. I wanted to make sure you had somewhere to go. Your mother's, your sister's, anywhere. The house is in my name. You signed it over during the refinance 3 years ago." I checked. And Margaret remembered. She remembered the day he had handed her a stack of papers and said it was just a formality, just paperwork, just something the bank required. She had signed without reading. She had trusted him. She had loved him. She had been a fool. What happened next, Margaret would later recount in a courtroom, on a witness stand, with a calm she did not feel. Daniel packed 2 suitcases for her. He put them by the front door. He told her he had already changed the locks on the back door and the garage. He told her that her car keys, which had been on the hook by the kitchen, were now on the dining room table, and that her car had been moved to the end of the driveway. He told her that he had already canceled her credit cards that were in his name, which was all of them, because Margaret had not had her own credit card in 17 years. He told her she had 30 minutes to take what she needed and leave. Vanessa stood in the kitchen the entire time, drinking the anniversary wine, scrolling through her phone, occasionally looking up at Margaret with an expression that Margaret would later describe as the look a woman gives a piece of furniture she is about to throw away. Margaret begged. She got down on her knees in front of her husband of 19 years, in her own foyer, 8.5 months pregnant, and she begged. She begged for the baby. She begged for 19 years of marriage. She begged for one more Christmas. And Daniel Ellsworth, the man Margaret had typed papers for at midnight, the man whose dental practice she had funded with her grandmother's pearls, the man she had buried 3 babies with, looked down at his wife on her knees in front of him and said, "Get up, Margaret. You're embarrassing yourself." She got up. She took the 2 suitcases. She walked out the front door. She made it 3 steps onto the porch before her legs gave out and she fell to her knees in the snow. Her wedding ring, which had grown loose during the pregnancy, slipped from her finger and disappeared into the white. She did not pick it up. She heard the deadbolt slide into place behind her. She heard Vanessa laugh at something inside the house. She heard a Christmas carol playing softly through the walls. And Margaret Ellsworth, 41 years old, 8.5 months pregnant, sat in the snow on the front porch of the house she had decorated that morning, and she could not breathe. Her phone was dead. Her car was at the end of the driveway, but she did not have the strength to walk to it. The wind was picking up. The snow was falling harder. She did not know how long she sat there. She would later say it felt like hours, but the police report would indicate that it was approximately 47 minutes. And then through the falling snow, she saw a pair of headlights moving slowly up the long driveway. An older blue Buick. A woman behind the wheel that Margaret did not recognize. The car stopped at the foot of the porch steps. The driver's side door opened. An older woman stepped out. She was perhaps 65 years old. She had silver hair pulled back into a low bun. She was wearing a wool coat that had seen better days. She walked up the porch steps without hesitation, took off her own coat, wrapped it around Margaret's shaking shoulders and said in a voice that was both kind and exhausted, "Honey, my name is Eleanor. I have been waiting at the end of this driveway for 93 nights. I am so sorry I didn't get here sooner." Margaret looked up at her through the snow. She tried to speak. She could not. Eleanor knelt down in front of her, took Margaret's frozen hands in her own warm ones and said, "Margaret, I know your name. I know about the baby. I know what just happened in that house. And I know who that woman is in your kitchen. Because that woman is my daughter. Her name is Vanessa. And she has done this before." Eleanor helped Margaret to her feet. She helped her down the porch steps. She put her in the passenger seat of the blue Buick. She found the small white business card from Dr. Patricia Hammond in Margaret's wallet, and she called the number while driving. Dr. Hammond answered on the first ring. By the time the Buick pulled into the emergency room entrance at Blunt Memorial Hospital 23 minutes later, Dr. Hammond was standing in the parking lot waiting for them. Margaret was admitted for shock, mild hypothermia, and early labor. The baby was monitored. The baby was fine. And as Margaret lay in a hospital bed at 9:30 that Christmas Eve night, hooked up to monitors with a saline drip in her arm, she looked at the older woman sitting in the chair beside her bed and she whispered, "Eleanor, why are you helping me?" And Eleanor Crow, mother of Vanessa Crow, looked at Margaret with eyes that had not slept properly in 8 years, and she told Margaret the story she had come to tell. In 2010, Eleanor's daughter Vanessa, then 20 years old, had moved to Memphis to start her career. Within a year, she had begun an affair with a married attorney named Robert Whitfield. Robert's wife, a woman named Catherine, was pregnant at the time. Vanessa convinced Robert to leave Catherine. Robert did. Vanessa then convinced Robert to put her name on his accounts, on his property, on his business interests. Robert did. And 6 months into the affair, when Catherine Whitfield was 26 weeks pregnant and living alone in a small apartment her sister had helped her rent, she went into premature labor. The baby, a boy she had already named Samuel, did not survive. Catherine Whitfield took her own life 4 months later. She was 33 years old. The funeral was small. The Whitfield family blamed Robert. Robert blamed himself. And Vanessa, who had what she had come for by then, took $22,000 in jewelry, a new car Robert had bought her, and disappeared back to Atlanta within 6 weeks of the funeral. Eleanor had tried in the years since to get her daughter help. She had tried therapy. She had tried interventions. She had tried more than once to call the authorities, only to discover that nothing Vanessa had done in Memphis was technically illegal. And so Eleanor had begun 3 years ago to do something different. She had begun to watch her daughter. Quietly. Carefully. From a distance. And when Vanessa had started spending Thursday afternoons in Nashville hotels with a married dentist from Maryville, Eleanor had started driving past that dentist's house. Every Tuesday. Every Thursday. For 3 months. Waiting for the night she knew was coming. Margaret listened to all of this from her hospital bed. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply listened. And when Eleanor was finished, when the older woman had reached the end of the story she had been carrying for 8 years, Margaret reached out and took Eleanor's hand. And she said, "Eleanor, thank you. I am going to have my baby, and then I am going to need your help. Because I am not Catherine Whitfield. And what your daughter and my husband did to me tonight is not going to be the end of my story. It is going to be the beginning of theirs." Eleanor squeezed Margaret's hand. She nodded. She said, "I have been waiting 8 years to hear someone say that." And in that small hospital room in Maryville, Tennessee, on the night of December 24, 2018, while Daniel Ellsworth was uncorking a second bottle of anniversary wine and Vanessa Crowe was choosing which of Margaret's bedrooms to convert into her closet, a quiet alliance was formed between a 41-year-old pregnant woman and a 65-year-old mother who had loved her daughter enough to finally tell the truth about her. And though none of them knew it yet, that alliance was going to bring down a house, a marriage, a dental practice, and a woman who had spent a decade believing she was untouchable. Margaret Ellsworth gave birth to her daughter on the morning of January 1, 2019. The baby weighed 7 pounds 2 ounces. She had a full head of dark hair. She had Margaret's eyes. Margaret named her Grace Eleanor Ellsworth, and when she said the middle name out loud in the delivery room, Eleanor Crowe, who was holding Margaret's hand, wept harder than she had wept in 30 years. Margaret's mother had passed in 2016, and her father in 2017, so the only family in the delivery room was Margaret's sister Patricia, who had driven down from North Carolina the moment Margaret called from the hospital, and Eleanor, who had become in 7 days, more of a mother to Margaret than Margaret had ever expected to have again in this life. Daniel was not notified of the birth. He had texted Margaret exactly twice in the week since Christmas Eve, both times to ask when she would be coming to collect the rest of her things. Margaret had not responded. She had been busy. Because while Margaret had been in the hospital recovering, Eleanor had been driving her to meet a 72-year-old semi-retired family law attorney named Ruth Beckman. Ruth Beckman had been practicing family law in East Tennessee for 46 years. She was the daughter of a coal miner. She had put herself through law school by working as a waitress and a typist and, for one memorable summer, a long-haul truck driver. She had built her reputation over 4 decades on a simple principle. She took the cases other lawyers would not take. She represented the women other lawyers would not represent. And when Eleanor Crowe walked into Ruth Beckman's small office in Maryville on December 28, 2018, holding the hand of a 41-year-old pregnant woman who could barely speak, Ruth Beckman took one look at Margaret, one look at the situation and said, "Honey, sit down. I'm going to make you some tea. And then you and I are going to take that house, that practice, and every dollar that man has ever earned, and we are going to make sure your daughter never wants for anything for the rest of her life. Are you with me?" Margaret nodded. Ruth Beckman went to make tea. And the slow, quiet, devastating dismantling of Daniel Ellsworth's life began that afternoon. Here is what Daniel Ellsworth did not know. Margaret had been the bookkeeper for Ellsworth Family Dentistry for the first 11 years of its existence. She knew every account. She knew every password. She knew the name of every supplier, every patient payment plan, every line item on every quarterly tax filing. She had stepped back from the bookkeeping in 2016 only because Daniel had hired a full-time office manager, a woman named Brenda, who had been with the practice ever since. And Brenda, as it turned out, was very loyal to Margaret. Brenda had been at Margaret's baby shower. Brenda had cried with Margaret through 2 of the 3 miscarriages. Brenda had also, in the past 14 months, watched her boss Daniel Ellsworth slowly become a man she no longer recognized. She had watched him write checks to a pharmaceutical sales representative for services that had never been rendered. She had watched him list Vanessa Crowe as a consultant on the practice's payroll, despite Vanessa never having performed a single hour of work for the practice. She had watched him expense personal hotel stays as continuing education conferences. And on the afternoon of December 29th, when Ruth Beckman called Brenda from Margaret's hospital room and asked simply, "Brenda, would you be willing to help us?" Brenda said, "I have been waiting for someone to ask me that for over a year. I have copies of everything. Where do you want me to send it?" Within 10 days, Ruth Beckman had assembled a forensic accounting team, a private investigator, and a paralegal whose sole job was to organize the documents Brenda began quietly forwarding from the dental practice. Within 3 weeks, they had identified over $180,000 in fraudulent payments from the practice to Vanessa Crowe. They had also identified credit card accounts that Vanessa had opened in Daniel's name without his knowledge, totaling another $47,000 in debt that Daniel had no idea existed. They had identified a small property in Gatlinburg that Daniel had purchased 6 months earlier in Vanessa's name only, using practice funds. And they had identified something far more damning. Daniel Ellsworth, in his eagerness to impress Vanessa, had been improperly accessing the personal information of his dental patients, pulling Social Security numbers and insurance information, and providing them to Vanessa, who had been using them through a series of shell companies in Georgia to open fraudulent lines of credit. This was no longer just a divorce case. This was a federal case. And on the morning of January 14, 2019, Ruth Beckman walked into the United States Attorney's office in Knoxville with a banker's box of evidence, set it on the prosecutor's desk and said, "I would like to introduce you to 2 people. One of them you are going to want to indict. The other one is going to be your star witness. Her name is Margaret Ellsworth, and she just gave birth to her first child 2 weeks ago." What happened over the next 18 months would become a case study in 3 different Tennessee law schools. Vanessa Crowe was arrested on March 14, 2019, at the house she had moved into 90 days earlier. The FBI executed a search warrant at 6:15 in the morning. They found her in Margaret's bathrobe, drinking coffee from Margaret's favorite mug. She was charged with 11 federal counts, including wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. Daniel Ellsworth was not arrested that morning, but he was placed under federal investigation. By April, the Tennessee Board of Dentistry had suspended his license pending review. By May, his dental practice had closed. By June, he had filed for personal bankruptcy. By July, the house on the cul-de-sac, the one Margaret had decorated for 19 Christmases, had been sold at auction, with the proceeds split between Margaret's divorce settlement and the federal restitution fund. By August, Daniel had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a tire shop in a neighboring county, where he had taken a job as a dental hygienist for $14 an hour. By September, Vanessa Crowe had accepted a plea deal. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that she would, almost certainly, never be able to pay. She gave birth to a son in the Federal Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky, 11 months into. There is one part of this story that has never been told publicly. It happened in the spring of 2024, more than 5 years after Christmas Eve. Margaret was working late one evening at the Doorstep Project. Grace was at home with the nanny. The office was quiet, and there was a knock at the front door of the Victorian house. Margaret got up from her desk, walked down the long hallway, and opened the door. Daniel Ellsworth was standing on the porch. He was 48 years old. He looked 60. He was holding a small grocery store bouquet of yellow daisies. He had not seen Margaret in over 5 years. He did not ask to come in. He stood on the porch in the evening light and he said, "Margaret, I'm not here to ask for anything. I drove past this place today. I saw the sign. I saw what you built. I needed to come and tell you just once in person that I was wrong. About you. About everything. I spent 19 years married to the strongest woman I have ever met, and I didn't see it until I had thrown her into the snow. I will carry that for the rest of my life. I'm leaving Tennessee next week. I have a job offer in Oregon. I won't come back. I just needed to say before I go that I'm sorry. For all of it. For Grace. For you. For who I became." Margaret stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not invite him in. She did not take the flowers. She looked at him with eyes that were neither cold nor kind, but simply tired in the way that a woman who has built something from nothing is tired. And she said, "Daniel, I forgave you a long time ago. Not because you deserved it, because carrying it was making me too heavy, and I had a daughter to raise. Grace doesn't know you. She doesn't need to know you. If she comes looking for you when she is 18, I will not stop her. But that is her choice to make, not yours. I hope you find a quiet life in Oregon. I hope you become a man who would never do to another woman what you did to me. I hope somewhere along the way you learn that the woman you locked out of that house on Christmas Eve was the best thing that ever happened to you, and that you threw her away for a woman who did not love you, who never loved you, who was using you the way you used me. I hope all of that for you, Daniel. I really do. But I am not going to be the one to give it to you. Good night. And please don't come back here. She closed the door. She did not slam it. She walked back down the long hallway to her office. She sat down at her desk. She did not cry. She picked up the phone, dialed a number and said, "Hi, sweetheart. Is Grace ready for bed? Tell her mama's on her way home." She turned off the office lights. She locked the front door. She walked past the small bouquet of yellow daisies that Daniel had left on the porch, and she did not pick them up. The next morning, the cleaning lady would throw them away. There is a thing the world likes to tell women, especially women in their 40s and 50s and 60s. The world likes to tell them that their worth is tied to the men who married them. That when those men leave, they take something away. That a woman discarded is a woman diminished. But the truth that Margaret Ellsworth learned on the coldest night of her life, is that your worth was never his to take. It was always yours. He was only ever borrowing it. And when he gave it back, even by force, even by cruelty, even by locking the door behind you in the snow, what he handed you was not abandonment. What he handed you was the rest of your life. Margaret did not destroy Daniel. The truth destroyed Daniel. Margaret simply stopped covering for him. And Vanessa did not lose to Margaret either. Vanessa lost to her own mother, Eleanor, who had finally, after 8 years and one buried Memphis baby, loved her daughter enough to tell the truth about her. That is what karma actually is. Karma is not the universe punishing the wicked with thunderbolts. Karma is the universe finally allowing the truth to be heard. And when the truth is finally heard, the wicked do not need to be punished. They punish themselves. They always have. They always will. Margaret Ellsworth is 46 years old now. Her daughter Grace just turned 7 last week. The Doorstep Project has helped over 2,000 women. Eleanor Crow is officially Grace's godmother, and she comes for Sunday dinner every week. Vanessa Crow was released from federal prison 2 years ago. She lives in a halfway house in Atlanta. She is not allowed to contact Margaret by court order, and she has not tried. Daniel Ellsworth, the last anyone in Maryville heard, was living somewhere outside of Portland. He has not remarried. He has not had any more children. And every December 24th, Margaret takes Grace to a small cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, where they leave a single white rose on the grave of a woman named Catherine Whitfield, who Margaret never met, but to whom Margaret owes, in some quiet and unspoken way, the entire life she has built. Catherine Whitfield is the reason Eleanor Crow was watching. Eleanor Crow is the reason Margaret survived. And Margaret is the reason that 2,000 other women, and counting, did not have to die on the doorsteps where their husbands had thrown them. That is what one woman in the snow on Christmas Eve started. That is the chain reaction her survival set off. That is the answer to the question this story began with. Karma did visit them, but not in the way anybody expected. Karma visited Daniel through the slow, patient unraveling of his own lies. Karma visited Vanessa through the mother, who finally stopped protecting her. And karma visited Margaret too. But for Margaret, karma did not come as punishment. Karma came as a 65-year-old woman in a blue Buick at the end of a long Tennessee driveway, on the coldest night of the year, who said, "Honey, I have been waiting 93 nights to find you. I am so sorry I didn't get here sooner." That is the karma that saved a life. And it is the karma that, somewhere in this country tonight, is rolling slowly up another driveway, headlights cutting through the dark, waiting for another woman in another snow, to finally come home. Before we close this story tonight, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.